Hello, welcome to the video on documents as sources of data in a research context and also how to conduct content analysis. The first part of this video will look at documents as sources of data and in the latter half at content analysis. So basically, what are documents? Documents are pieces of information that can be read, but also it can include visuals as well. Some documents may not have been produced specifically for the purposes of research, such as diaries and letters and personal communications. These may be preserved so that they are available for analysis, such as in the archives of a library. Again, you would need to contact the library to get access to this information. How do we know whether or not the documents are good to analyse and to spend time examining? We will be looking at its authenticity, its credibility, its representativeness, and its meaning. And you should always think about these variables for when you are assessing the quality of a document, even, for example, a journal article. So when you are researching, please consider these. What type of documents may be available for you to peruse? Well, you may have personal, public, organisational and mass media outputs and virtual outputs, and we're going to look at these individually. So personal documents, the evidence of that could be diaries, letters, or even autobiographies. They could be used as a primary source of data in a qualitative research. However, it could also augment other forms or other approaches of qualitative research. Quite interestingly, when you're doing an analysis of an organisation, you would like to know the historical context of it, and this is where you may look at the diaries and autobiographies. Diaries may be used as a method of also data collection, in turn available to other researchers, and we'll look at these at another time. Public documents are basically, as the word says, available to the general public to read. This could be in the form of legislation, reports of public inquiries, but it can be a time-consuming process because most of these would actually represent verbatim the communication at these events. One may have a question of credibility because the original document may be biased. Where may we find these public documents? Online, you can find them through forfuss.ie, or in general, the government departments are found at irl.gov.ie. Organisational documents. There's two forms. One could be in the public domain and the other not in the public domain. Getting access to the latter obviously depends on the relationship you have with that organisation. The public domain documents are those that are freely available and open to your interpretation, obviously. However, in the those not in the public domain could include company in-house newsletter, reports, communications on policy statements, manuals for new recruits. Maybe in an ethnographic perspective, where you actually are involved or immersed within the organisation, you may have access to this information. Mass media outputs are those from television, the newspaper, the radio and film. There are sometimes some issues with authenticity when authorship is unclear. So for mass media outputs, it is better to use well-recognised data sources, such as the Herald Tribune, the Irish Times, the Times for newspapers, for radio, public broadcasted radio, television, the recognised TV channels. The visual documents could include, for example, photographs. And photographs could be actually used as illustrations or data prompts. And remember when we were talking about qualitative data and the types and approaches one could use, where we actually said you might use a visual as a means of a prompt. And this is where we might get the visual documents to assist in that. However, it's important to know the context of the photograph and not just accept the photograph at face value. You as a researcher needs to actually ask the owner or the publisher of that photograph, what context is this actually set in? Photographs in business research actually can be the focus of content analysis and also used in structured interviews. There is a growing use of photographs and visual materials, and the tendency is to be used by qualitative researchers. This is just an example of a photograph in business research, sourced by Davidson 2009. So virtual outputs are examples of documents published on the internet, personal websites, forums, mailing lists, message boards, even private email communication. However, you need to ensure that they're all authentic and that the interpretation is correct when one reads the information. When you're actually interpreting sources of data, you need to be aware of the written documents, the images, the artifacts, landscapes, performances, etc., from a cultural perspective, and ensure the interpretation of the text is appropriate to that particular culture that the interpretation is coming from. Be aware that audiences may interpret different meanings to those intended by the author. So what are the analytical means of interpreting documents? Well, qualitative content analysis, semiotics, hermeneutics, and historical analysis. We're going to look at each of these four in detail. Qualitative content analysis is basically searching for themes that become quite evident in the documents that you are actually researching. The process of extracting these themes is actually time-consuming. And unless you have a predetermined list of themes, these themes will only emerge once the data has been analysed. Semiotics is to do with signs and symbols of everyday life. And it's basically trying to interpret how people interpret those particular signs that are actually prevalent in the documents. Hermeneutics is to do with text and the interpretation of texts. And basically, it's the meaning of a document understood from the perspective of its author. It requires sensitivity to the social and historical context in which the document was produced. Historical analysis is to trace the actual history of an organization or industry, to analyze the versions of events, to study the methods used historically, enabling the interpretation of existing organizational arguments, and enabling a more rigorous assessment of the claims made by management today. So that's the end of documents as sources of data. Now we're going to move on to one of the means that we identified of analysing the data, and that was content analysis, which stemmed from the thematic perspective. So let's go into this in a little bit more detail. So what is content analysis? It is basically an approach to the analysis of documents and texts. It quantifies content in terms of predetermined categories. It is usually adopted in a quantitative research strategy. So in order to develop a content analysis, you have to make sure that the questions are posed that will enable this form of analysis to be conducted. So the research type questions for content analysis, it must be clearly specified before the analysis. You must decide which dimensions of text to quantify. For example, news coverage of an issue, who, what, how much, where, and why. how many different views are to be represented, what is selected for inclusion. You have to think about omissions, what is not reported, and also why is it not reported. So for content analysis, in selecting a sample, if working with the mass media, 2 dimensions are possible for random sampling. Maybe the media itself or the dates of publication. I myself have used very much so the dates of publication as a means of selecting a sample. But maybe the media itself is a sample that you use. So sampling the media, progressive narrowing down, ignoring or omitting certain types of content. So you have to, for example, the narrowing could be the determination of the types of text. Are we just looking at printed or visual, documents, or the mass media? If mass media, which kind? TV, radio, newspaper, magazines, or maybe a combination? Then within the media, are we using tabloid or broadsheet newspapers? Maybe we're using the sampling dates, and that's predetermined by a historical event like the Enron case. And you're more open if the study is an ongoing general phenomenon. And when do we actually end? Well, that's a matter of judgment, and it's subjective. It's a subject that the researcher has to choose themselves. So that's how we sample the data. Now, what is to be analysed? We have to decide on words, themes, dispositions, maybe images, maybe even the actors themselves. So with words, it could be phrases, it could be frequency of words, it could be overall subjects and themes, such as environmental issues. It could be dispositions of biases and ideology. It could be the protagonist's an alternative voice when it comes to significant actors. So once we actually have decided on the sample and then on how it's to be analysed, we need to consider the coding. So in content analysis, we use a tabular form onto which the coded data will be entered. Each column represents a dimension to be analysed. Each row represents a unit of analysis. And then codes are written into blank cells in a table. What might this look like? Well, by golly, I've got an example. So this is an example here of a coding schedule. So we have information about a gender of the actor, and then we have age of actor, qualifications, profession, place, rank, evidence, features of courage displayed, sought or observed, looking at using words, tools mentioned, obstacles mentioned, etc. That's sourced from Harris 2001. So the coding manual is a list of instructions for coders. It lists all possible categories for each dimensions, shows which codes refer to which categories. You're given guidance on how to decide on a code if the code has not been explained, and it explains what to do if more than one code applies. So it basically is a direction on what to do when it comes to coding. So an example of a coding manual could be the gender of an actor. Code could be 1, it could be 2, it could be 3, 3 being unknown. We identify, for example, features of courage displayed, sought or observed. It could be looking at the words used to describe courage. And we propose a number of words, and we put a code of numbers beside that to infer what those the meaning is attributed to. What are the advantages and disadvantages of content analysis? Well, it's transparency. You have the ability to do longitudinal analysis. It's unobtrusive, there's flexibility, and there's ease of access. The disadvantage of content analysis is question of authenticity, credibility, and representativeness of documents. It's could be biased and there's interpretation open to the coders. Invalid reference of manifest content. Invalid inference of manifest content. Now, unless people have access to the interpretation of the code, well, that then may occur. And the inability to answer why questions. I hope this video has been useful and you now understand documents as sources of data and how to conduct content analysis. Thank you.